Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Celebrate World Tourism Day with the World Wildlife Fund, helping Africa's people and wildlife rebound from the pandemic. Presented by Nikhil Advani, the World Wildlife Fund's Director, Climate, Communities, and Wildlife. Thank you so much for being here today. Over to you, Nikhil.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all attending, and thank you to NatHab for inviting me to present. So I'd like to start off by giving the apologies of our Chief Conservation Officer, Nick Seckern. He got pulled into a last-minute presentation that he has to do to the board. So he is unable to introduce the presentation today. We were hoping that he would speak a bit to the significance of World Tourism Day and also the importance of tourism to conservation in Africa. But I will attempt to fill that void. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give an overview of a new project we've launched called the African Nature-Based Tourism Platform. I'm hoping the presentation will only be about 20 to 25 minutes and that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. Great. So my name is Nikhil Advani. I work at WWF. I lead a program here called Climate, Communities, and Wildlife. I was born and brought up in Kenya. We have some of the most amazing landscapes and biodiversity on Earth. You know, as a kid, we used to go to Masai Mara in the west of the country. We'd go to the Aberdares, we'd go to the coast, and visiting all of these places really built up a love of nature for me. So on this slide, you can see the top left is this amazing place called Solio Ranch. It's near Mount Kenya, huge populations of both black and white rhinos. And then the bottom left, obviously the iconic Masai Mara, where you're almost guaranteed to see lions and all the other big cats that we have in Kenya. So I'm very lucky in that, you know, I had this upbringing, and then throughout my studies, I followed this same path. So I moved to the US in 2000. I'd been in boarding school in Kenya, boarding school in England prior to that. I moved to Texas and I got my undergraduate degree in ecology, evolution, and behavior. I then went on to do my PhD, also at the University of Texas at Austin. And that was looking at how climate change is impacting species and trying to get a better mechanistic understanding of that. I then worked for the Nature Conservancy for a year prior to joining WWF in 2013. And so I now direct this program at WWF called Climate, Communities, and Wildlife. And we are researching how climate change is impacting people and wildlife around the world, and then developing and implementing solutions to help them adapt to those changes. So all this work was going really well, and then all of a sudden COVID hits. And in July of last year, I get this phone call from the Chief Conservation Officer, Nick, saying that he wants me to lead this new project. So we developed this proposal to the Global Environment Facility. We pitched this platform that will connect funders to beneficiaries in 11 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. And those beneficiaries are communities and small and medium enterprises that are involved in nature-based tourism and have had their income drop significantly as a result of COVID. So we started developing the proposal in July. We submitted it in record time. It only took us about 4.5 months. So by late November, early December, we submitted the proposal and it was approved very quickly in January. The official start date of the project was in April of this year. And it's 3 years of funding that we have from the Global Environment Facility. So I'm going to talk about this project today, the African Nature-Based Tourism Platform. I'll tell you a bit about the different partners that we're working with and where we're at in the project and what the next steps are. And then hopefully we can open it up for a really fruitful discussion after that. So this is a very brief overview of the project. You know, we got, like I said, we got $1.9 million from the Global Environment Facility, And the goal is to mobilize at least $15 million in funding for communities and small and medium enterprises. And in a second, I'll talk a bit about what that funding is likely to look like. Just very quickly, I forgot to mention the significance of World Tourism Day. So it's been observed since 1980, and it's observed on September 27th of every year. And it's the UN World Tourism Organization that's come up with this day. I also want to just give you a couple of stats on how badly tourism in Africa has been affected by the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you on the call today have traveled to some of the countries that we're working in, and you'll know just how important tourism is to sustaining the wildlife that we find in those places, to sustaining the communities that live in and around the wildlife, and to sustaining the economies of these countries as a whole. So I actually had the very good fortune of getting to spend 5 months over winter this past year in Uganda. That's where my family home is. And I hate winter, so it was a good excuse to work from there. Also, given that most of my work is in Africa now, I wasn't really able to travel regionally for work, but it at least put me in the same time zone as all the people I was working with. I had the same internet connectivity challenges as they did. So it really made me feel like, I was in Africa working on African stuff and dealing with all the complications that we have to deal with when we're there. So it was an amazing time. I also managed to take some trips to national parks, for example. And I just put up 3 images that really highlight how important tourism is. And I'm just going to focus on Uganda. So this first image shows us tracking the mountain gorillas in Imgahinga National Park. So this is in the south of Uganda. It's one of the 2 mountain gorilla populations that we have, right? There's the Bwindi population, which is only in Uganda. And this is part of the Virunga population, which spans Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you'll see here, there was only 4 of us, 4 tourists that were actually trekking the gorillas that day. Again, very abnormal. The 2 other people actually had just signed up on the day of the trek. So prior to them joining, it was only my brother and I that had signed up. And typically for this group, they can take at least 8 tourists, and they're almost always sold out for the permits. But you'll see us walking with the rangers, walking with the porters. There's the guides that you don't see. So just for 4 tourists, we had about 8 support staff, I think it was, walking with us. And then there's obviously the advanced team that's tracking the gorillas from where they left them the night before, which I think this time was about 6 people. So there's so many people, and this is just on the face of it, right? There's everybody behind the scenes with Uganda Wildlife Authority, the Porters Association, all these other people that are involved and depend on that tourism money. So this was one trip. The other trip we took was to the north of Uganda, the northeast of Uganda, this beautiful park called Kedepo National Park. And this was on a game drive with one of the drivers there. The weekend that we were there, we stayed for 3 nights at the lodge. We were the only people, not only in the entire lodge, but in the 3 days we were there, I didn't see a single tourist vehicle in the entire national park. And again, on a weekend in January, this is very abnormal. That would not be the case usually. This shows you another glimpse of people that are dependent on tourism money, right? There's all the guides, the drivers for the lodges you're staying at. There's all the staff at the lodges. And then obviously Uganda Wildlife Authority and the rangers at the national park. And then there's all the supply chain side of it that you don't even see, right? The people that are growing fruits and vegetables and providing milk and all these different products we consume when we're at the lodges. None of that you actually see, but these are all people that indirectly are heavily dependent on tourism. So this is in Kedepo. And then this last image, I think, really sort of captures the situation that we have in Africa with tourism communities, wildlife, all sort of coexisting in the same space. So this here is the Virunga Massif, and you can see the three main peaks that make it up. On the peaks themselves, or the little mountains you see, that's all the protected area. And around that, you have, I think, is the densest rural population in Africa around these parks. So it's a heavily populated area. But because of tourism and all the money that it brings in, these communities have learned to coexist with the gorillas and the other wildlife that we find in these areas. You go to this part of Uganda, they have access to education, to healthcare, to things like clean water that you wouldn't find in other parts of the country, and definitely not in other parts of the continent. And it's because of this industry around mountain gorillas that brings in hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year. So it's super, super important. And I think this just gives you a glimpse into Uganda, and that's sort of my experience there over the last few months. But as those of you who've been to Africa, you'll know that it extends well beyond this. So just to give you some statistics, the World Travel and Tourism Council published a report in 2020. They said that in 2019, travel and tourism in Africa contributed a total of 7.1% to gross domestic product, as well as 24.6 million jobs. So this is across the whole continent. As a result of COVID, between April and December, there was a 90% drop in international tourism arrivals. And that did vary from country to country. There were some countries where it was essentially zero. This translated into a loss of about $87 billion, 12.4 million jobs, and between 70 to 90% of conservation funding. And this was only up until December of last year. So these losses are obviously projected to get a lot bigger because this pandemic, as we've all seen, is not going away anytime soon. So just to give you a bit of history, the context that we're dealing with, I also wanted to give a bit of insight into my experience, the fact that I'm actually from this part of the world, and how important it is that we provide relief funding for the communities in particular to get through this phase of COVID, and then really focus on the longer term recovery and resilience of this tourism sector. So going back to the platform, these are some of the partners that we have on the platform. We've really tried to make this as collaborative as possible. WWF is the organization that was responsible for developing the proposal. We're controlling the funds, we're doing the sub-grants, but really it's a truly collaborative effort. And there's not one single person that owns the project. So to give you an idea of some of the partners, there's obviously us, WWF, I just mentioned our role. There's the Global Environment Facility, who's funding the whole project. RCMRD is this intergovernmental organization based in Kenya, and they are actually hosting all of the data. So all of the data that we're collecting from communities, they are receiving it, they're processing it, and they'll host it for the term of the project and hopefully well beyond that. And the really nice thing about that is that the data is owned and hosted in Africa. And then in 9 of the 11 countries, we have for the most part, CBNRM networks, or in a couple of cases, we've got local NGOs. And these are the groups that are actually facilitating the interaction between the platform and the communities. And we really wanted to get as close as possible to the communities and remove as many of those sort of middle actors as possible. And that's why we're working with all of these networks, who in some cases are tiny, tiny organizations. They only have 2 or 3 staff. And for that reason, we had to do risk assessments, we had to develop contracts, budgets, we had to do all of this stuff that was a lot of work behind the scenes, but was really important to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible, and really trying to make this a bottom-up project, which is driven by the communities themselves. So those networks are in Congo and Botswana, KWCA in Kenya, Kawikoda in Malawi, RGCRN in Mozambique, Africa Ignite in South Africa, CWCMA in Tanzania, UTA in Uganda, and ZCBNRM in Zambia, and lastly, Campfire in Zimbabwe. We're still trying to figure out an on-the-ground partner in Rwanda. In Namibia, we've chosen not to do a lot of what we're doing in the other countries because Namibia is so far ahead of the game in doing a lot of this already. And we're considering adding Madagascar to the list of countries we're working in as well. So we're also being fluid and adapting to the situation as needed. We also have Maliasili, who is hosting a series of lessons labs. What they're trying to do is to promote learning and knowledge sharing amongst all the project partners, and also learning from other initiatives that have been successful. So the most recent lessons lab we just had was actually focused on the conservancies in Namibia and the Masai Mara conservancies in Kenya, because both of those are really good examples of groups that have come together and have managed to get relief funding basically since the pandemic has started. It's quite impressive the amount of funding that they've been able to mobilize. We've got the Luke Hoffman Institute as well, who is the group that actually conceived of this whole idea and sort of developed the pre-proposal before we took it over. And then lastly, the Nature Conservancy, and they are going to be helping us with identifying investment in some of the privately owned small and medium enterprises as a possible solution amongst one of many different financing solutions that we potentially have out there. Okay, so what are the different components of the project? The first component is all around the data. And I'm going to show you some of the data that we already have that's come in. But the idea was we need to better understand how communities in these countries are actually involved in tourism. What was their revenue, their staffing levels before COVID, and how has COVID affected that? So in this sense, the platform is actually really important because in some parts of Africa, we know this quite well. Take Namibia, for example. They really have a good gauge of communities' involvement in tourism and revenue that generates. In many of these other countries, we know very, very little about this. You know, I've been doing quite a bit of work with Malawi and Mozambique, for example, in this project, and we just barely know anything about what's happening in those countries when it comes to tourism, with the exception of a few isolated parks over there. So this is actually filling a really big void that will have huge value beyond the life of this project, collecting all of this baseline information. So the CBNRM networks and local NGOs have been facilitating this. They've been going out to the communities, collecting the data, processing it, and uploading it to the platform where people can now access it. We have a public data viewer, which I'll show you in just a bit. And then if you actually want to get access to the detailed survey data, you need to register to be given access to the platform. Component 2 is the biggest component of the project, and this is really the meat of the project, where we're trying to matchmake between funders and these beneficiaries. So we're trying to identify what funding opportunities are out there. We're then trying to help potential beneficiaries develop proposals to access these funding opportunities. And one thing I neglected to mention for component 1 is that the beneficiaries go beyond just communities. So we're also working with small and medium enterprises that are involved in tourism, primarily lodges. Many of these are privately owned, and they too will be submitting their data to the platform, because there's a number of funding opportunities that exist out there, right? There's the grant-based opportunities that will probably be most relevant to the communities. But there's also a fair amount of investment opportunities. There's these soft loans that are being offered where they're interest-free for the first 2 years, and then they have a 6% interest rate for the life of the loan, for example. And these might be more attractive to the small and medium enterprises. So we're also trying to facilitate that, even though our primary focus is on the communities. And then lastly, there's also the policy aspect of this. So we're working with the Africa Green Stimulus Program. It's part of this huge sort of conference of environment ministers in in Africa. And we're working with different policy mechanisms to raise the importance of this work of tourism and conservation, and also to ensure that all the funding that's available for this is being directed in the right manner, right? And that it's ensuring that this industry will build back better in a green way, in a more sustainable way, and be more resilient to future similar shocks and stressors. And then there's obviously the last component of the project, which is all about monitoring and evaluation and knowledge management, which is crucial to all the projects that we do. Okay, so where are we at the moment? We've completed data collection, or getting very close to completing data collection in about 9 of the 11 countries. And all that data is slowly being processed and added to the platform. And I'll give you a glimpse of what the data looks like in just a second. I've already talked about the whole data collection process and all the actors involved in that. And the big step for us now, the real focus, is on the funding. So we have all this baseline data. What funding opportunities can we identify for all of these places? And how can we help facilitate that? How can we ensure that the funding gets to the people that it needs to get to? What help do they need in developing proposals, for example? And just to touch on one thing which I didn't mention was, we're collecting data from all these communities. The way in which these communities are organized really varies from country to country. So in some countries like Kenya, we're only focusing on the community conservancies. And it's already this like pre-existing mechanism, which makes it very easy for us to gather and consolidate information. So each conservancy will be filling out a survey that captures all the different ways in which community members are involved in tourism within that conservancy. But in other countries, we've had to get creative. The countries that don't have a conservancy system, for example, we're collecting data at the community level by each community. So for each single community, we're aggregating all the different ways in which they're involved in nature-based tourism. And then in some places, we're also doing it by sector. So for example, in South Africa, one of the people we'll be collecting data from are bird guides. And across the entire country, we're going to be consolidating information from all the different bird guides, again, to detail what their staffing and income was prior to COVID and how that's been affected by COVID. So there's different ways in which we're collecting and processing the data. And this is what the data looks like. So this is only from a few countries so far. You'll see we've uploaded data from Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and Botswana. So far, you only see 100 different sort of enterprises or communities that have been surveyed. You'll see a big drop in their staffing. It's dropped from just over 3,000 to just over half at the moment. You can also see their primary involvement in tourism. You see the gender distribution. And this has been really interesting, is the kinds of financing that they would seek. And we're finding that there's very little appetite to take on additional debt. I think a lot of these enterprises are already quite heavily in debt, and by and large, grant-based funding is what they're seeking. And you can explore all of this at the website that you see on the screen, naturebasedtourism.africa, which is our website. /data will take you to this data viewer. And we'll have more and more of this data coming online in the next few days and weeks. So just to wrap up, and I hope that we'll have lots of good conversation and questions after this, but I've given you an overview of the project, where we're at with the project, what our goals are for this project going forward. And I think I was just at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, and met with a lot of potential funders. The EU governments, for example, are putting a lot of money into COVID relief in Africa. So there is funding out there, but the feeling is that, well, at least my feeling was from attending this, that they're now thinking beyond the relief phase. I think this whole sort of, relief aspect, relief funding aspect for COVID is beginning to wear down on people, and they're now looking more towards the longer term recovery of the sector and building resilience of the sector in the longer term. So I think even as a platform, we're kind of evolving in terms of the kind of funding that we're targeting, and we're really looking for ways for these communities and small and medium enterprises to build back better and to increase their resilience to future similar shocks and stressors. So we're trying to think of innovative ways to do this as well. What kind of innovative projects can we come up with to pitch to donors? We're also very keen to target individual donors, for example, through WWF. There's many people that we work with that have a strong affinity for many of the places we're working in. And we're trying to explore ways in which we can try and get any sort of donor money that's available to the communities. And the beauty of this whole project is that because it's fully funded by the Global Environment Facility, all of our core costs are covered. So we're purely here to serve in this matchmaking role between beneficiaries and donors. And in cases where we're actually involved in the funding, all of the funding that we receive will actually go directly to the beneficiary communities because all of our costs are covered. So that's all I have for today. Again, a big thank you to NatHab for inviting us to present on this project. And I think we now have quite a bit of time available for questions and answers. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Nikhil. I really appreciate you being here today. That was terrific. Before we start the question and answer period, I'd like to remind everyone that you could submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So we do have some questions, absolutely. One question was about the Africa Wildlife Foundation. Are they involved? And if they aren't, do you know why not?
Yeah, very good question. We had quite a few calls with AWF when we were developing this project. We actually had, I was based in DC at the time, and most of our calls were with Africa-based actors. And so my calls would start at 6 a.m. every day, and we'd have back-to-back calls up until noon. And we must have consulted with about 80 different groups, individuals and organizations while we were developing the proposal. AWF were definitely involved in that. They also have some kind of a community, kind of like an organization of communities that they're building in Africa, which had potential to collaborate with this. But I think at the time it wasn't as well developed as it might be now. So now is when we're really getting to that stage of re-engaging with all these people that we spoke to right about this time last year, actually, when we were developing the proposal. So we've definitely been in touch with them, and we will be re-engaging with them as well.
Great, that's great. So where do countries like South Africa stand with respect to ecotourism?
Yeah, very good question. I'd actually never been to South Africa until 2018, and I love going on safaris, and I always felt that we have everything we need in East Africa. And then work took me to South Africa, and obviously I tacked on safaris. And South Africa is very interesting because South Africa has a huge domestic tourism market. I think far and away the largest in sub-Saharan Africa, or anywhere in Africa, actually. Kenya maybe comes close. Oh, sorry, Kenya is second, but doesn't come anywhere near South Africa, I don't think. And part of it is they just have this amazing infrastructure to facilitate that. They've got a good road network throughout the country. almost all their parks, you have sand parks accommodation, which is very affordable. And there's these excellent like bandas, tents that you can stay in. Within each of these complexes, they have a grocery store where you can buy food and drinks. And then you just self-drive and do safaris around the park on your own. So the way they're set up really helps to facilitate that domestic tourism market. Now that said, South Africa is also really struggling. They also are heavily dependent on foreign tourists, as many of you will know. They also have really high-end safaris over there. So a lot of that income has just disappeared. So they too are struggling. In South Africa, we're working with this local NGO, Africa Ignite, but we're also working with the national people and park structure. And actually what we're trying to do in South Africa as part of this project is almost create some kind of a CBNRM network, which is what we're working with in a lot of the other countries, but South Africa doesn't have that structure. So these are some of the sort of side benefits that might come from this project, is actually helping to create these kinds of structures within these countries. And then just lastly, I'll say on this note of domestic tourism, you'll often hear a big sort of buzzword in the last year and a half has been alternatives to tourism. And people are suggesting that we need to, because of the way COVID has affected this, we need to think of ways in which, we can generate revenue for conservation beyond tourism in Africa. And as someone who's lived and worked in Africa for a very long time and now is working on this project, I don't think we're going to find anything that comes close to tourism in terms of the amount of money that it brings in. It's just the numbers that I presented to you at the start. You're not going to find any alternatives that come close to that. So by all means, let's explore these things. Let's explore carbon credits, payment for ecosystem services, alternative livelihoods as supplementary sources of income, but nothing is going to replace tourism. But I think one thing that does have potential to really grow is domestic tourism. So like I said, it's big in South Africa, but it could be a lot bigger there and in many other countries. And as an initial step in that, we're hiring a consultant to do a study on the current landscape of domestic tourism, and then starting to explore some options to grow that market.
Terrific. Well,
that answered very long answer, but it just opened up a whole bunch of different issues that I thought were worth addressing.
Well, that was interesting. There was a question addressing that issue of how many Africans don't actually see the animals that are part of their tourism, and if you were getting them involved. So that's really great to know. So does the project get involved with vaccinations at all, or helping to facilitate that to get tourism back on track?
That's an excellent question. It's not something we've gone into. We're stretched really thin as it is, working in so many different countries, and yeah, it's not a topic that we've actually explored. I'll give you my sort of impression of what's happening on that. When I was in Uganda, for example, my brother and all of his colleagues got vaccinated even before I did. I only got vaccinated when I came back to the US in May. So the vaccine availability is increasing. You've seen commitments by the Biden administration just last week to really ramp that up. But there is also skepticism in Africa. This is not just a thing that's reserved for the US. There's also vaccine skepticism over there. And then obviously there's many of the sort of bureaucratic hurdles and corruption that unfortunately are quite commonplace over there that are making administering the vaccine slower than it should be. But it is definitely increasing, and hopefully, I don't know, hopefully by this time next year, you'll see a much larger proportion of people vaccinated.
Let's hope so. Can you talk a little bit about the Global and Environment Facility? Specifically, what exactly is that group? And is it a UN? Is it involved with the UN, or or could you shed some light for us?
Yeah, great question. You know, funny enough, I actually don't, even though they gave me $2 million, I don't know a whole lot about them. It's a multilateral agency. It's funded by governments from all over the world. I don't know if it's actually technically under the auspices of the UN off the top of my head, but they fund these kinds of projects that are focused on the environment all over the world. And this is actually a fairly small project by their standards. It's called a MSP, a medium-sized project. They have projects that are in the tens of millions of dollars. And WWF is an agency for the Global Environment Facility. So what that means is if there's somebody who wants to access their funding, we will actually serve as the go-between between the Global Environment Facility and that recipient. So in this case, we ourselves actually put in the proposal, and our GEF agency served as that go-between. But yeah, they've been around for a long time, and they have these different funding cycles. So they're just about to start planning, I think, for GEF 8, which is the 8th funding cycle, where they'll be securing billions of dollars from different governments from around the world. And then over the subsequent years after that, be funding projects like this.
Speaking of which, are you working to develop a donor network on the continent, or are you focusing mostly on the Western donors?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, there is definitely potential for giving. As far as this project goes, we're really trying to be in service to any of the donors that are out there, and this includes the country governments. So when I was in Marseille, I actually managed to meet the Kenyan Minister for Tourism and Wildlife, Najib Balala, and he just mentioned how he had just approved a recent $2 million tranche of funding for the sector. So the governments themselves have money, and they too have been spending a lot of their money over the last year and a half on this. And we're trying to see how we can help them too. So they probably have the biggest spending capacity on the continent, but there's also scope for corporates. Many of the countries we work in, Kenya, South Africa, have a huge corporate presence. So we will also be looking at targeting some of those. And then there is some potential for individual giving, but that's definitely not as high as it is here in the US, for example.
So speaking of alternate revenue streams, how vulnerable are the tourist areas to the extraction industry if the tourism doesn't come back quickly enough?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been hearing, I don't know, when you say extractives, if you're thinking like just say mining or things like that, but I'm thinking much larger than that, right? People that are using natural resources, be it chopping down trees for charcoal or entering protected areas for water or bushmeat, all these kinds of things. I'm hearing anecdotal stuff, sort of anecdotal information of there being an increase in, say, poaching and number of snares. But the truth is, I don't think we have any good hard data on that yet. So I'd be reluctant to say that it's increasing. And also, when I was in Uganda, I was chatting to all the rangers about this wherever I was, and the Ugandan government had done a really impressive job of keeping all of those rangers employed. So there's been a huge dip in tourism, obviously, and but all the rangers that were employed in those areas were still employed, and they might have had some sort of a different structure to their pay and whatnot. And I don't know how long they're going to be able to sustain this. But a lot of the governments did do a good job of keeping these core operations running.
Well, that's wonderful to know, because that was another question some people had. How did people in the tourism industry survive and earn money during this period of time? So that's it's good to know that there was some help out there. I'm sure it was tough for a bunch of other people. So you spoke a lot about relief for the communities and the people. One of our patrons would like to know, are you working on finding out what is happening to the animals or the environment? Are you collecting any data on this?
Yeah, again, that's a very good question. And I think, early on in COVID, people, again, it was probably mostly anecdotal, but you saw these pictures of wildlife almost thriving in some places because of the absence of humans. Again, there's probably some sort of studies that are going on. I know we're working with Frankfurt Zoological Society. I've spoken to them a few times, and they have a project going on collecting data on exactly that. But through the platform itself, we will not be doing that. Again, our time and resources are spread really thin, and there's only so much we can do. But keep an eye out. There will be some studies that are coming out on that topic. And that's the other thing, on the platform website, we have a news section where we'll be promoting all the latest sort of articles, publications, upcoming events on this topic from everybody in the space. So keep an eye on that page, and you'll see these updates coming over time.
Great. So let's talk about you specifically. One of our guests, his wife went to UT Austin and wanted to know how you got there over any other university in the US or the world.
That's such a great question. It was a completely random pick. I only applied to UT Austin when I thought I was going to go to dental school after boarding school in England. Decided it was too soon to make that decision. So I was like, let me come to the US, get a bachelor's degree, and think about it. I put very little thought into it. I applied to UT, I got in, I loved it so much. And then for grad school, I only applied to UT again. Luckily, I got in again. And I was actually just in Austin this weekend because I've just joined the advisory council for the College of Natural Sciences, which I was in. So I still have a strong bond with the university.
Great, great. All right. Another question I have for you. How are the projects prioritized? I'm sure there are plenty of more projects than there is money to go around. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, wow. That is, that's the million-dollar question. We had to be quite sensitive going into this project of not raising expectations. So we've collected, by the end of the data collection period, we're going to have over 1,000 surveys. And each of those surveys will represent a single conservancy or a single community. So it's going to be capturing data from tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And there's no way that we're going to fundraise for all of those people. And so there's going to be many different ways in which we do this. I think one of the most obvious ones is the countries where we have the most engagement, where the whole data collection has really all happened seamlessly. We have strong engagement from the different people we're collaborating with on the ground. I think naturally, because of their dedication to it, those will rise to the top. And the benefit of that is that those are probably the ones where we really will have the least number of hiccups in terms of actually getting the funding out to them and implementing some of the projects which we will propose to do. So I think that's one, and that's kind of looking at it more from an operational perspective. And then the other one is from the get-go, I have been really adamant that we serve the most marginalized communities. One of the ideas, for example, when the platform idea came about, was that we build this platform and that all the communities and the small and medium enterprises will come and register directly on the platform. And for any of you that have even just traveled in Africa, you'll know that that's laughable, right? I mean, the internet connection in these places is so weak, let alone having access to the kinds of devices that's needed to upload the information, and also just access to that information itself. And this is why we've invested so much money in actually getting out there and facilitating this data collection. But going forward, my goal is really that we try and serve the most marginalized communities. Obviously, also those that have a strong involvement in tourism. There are some, I'm sure we're going to have many people participating who, you know, they really don't depend on tourism that much, and COVID has maybe affected them just a bit. Again, they might not be the highest priority. But I really want to try and put some of these places on the map that are outside of the typical sort of conservation tourism realm in Africa, which my impression over the last few months has been, you know, places in Kenya, the whole of Namibia, maybe parts of Botswana, parts of South Africa. There's some of these places that have been getting a lot of attention. And a lot of it is also driven by where donors have current investments, right? So a lot of these governments that are investing money in these places, they're provided relief funding, but they're only providing it to places where they already have a lot of funding investment. So how can we go beyond that and sort of move beyond the status quo?
So that's a good question, isn't it? So what is the status of tourism in Africa now and for the coming year? And what do you see as the largest barriers towards rebuilding the foreign tourism activity?
Yeah, wow. Wow, I told you, these questions are just amazing. I could have presented for 15 minutes. Okay, so let's see. I was there from December to May. And when I was in Uganda, empty, hardly anyone there. When I was in Kenya, you were definitely seeing more people at the parks, including some foreigners, but also a fair amount of domestic tourism. And then I think the real sort of telltale sign is when you hit high season, right? So this past summer was typically high season in places like Kenya for the migration, you know, massive. This is the biggest single month, for example, when that happens, is the biggest single month for tourism in the country, probably, in terms of the dollars it's bringing in. And likewise in places like Uganda, you know, when you try to go in the summer, it's really difficult to get gorilla permits because that's when all the foreigners are coming in and buying them up during their summer vacation. And the numbers were still very, very low. So I personally feel that high season next year, which would be our summer here in the US, is when you might start to see a bit of an uptick in terms of numbers. But if you look at the projections that people are saying, it could be 2024 before we see a return to normal. So it's going to be a long, long time. That said, if you're willing to take all the safety measures, you're willing to comply with all the rules, the COVID testing, for example, traveling is a somewhat stressful experience at the moment. You have to know what the requirements are for the countries you're going to, for the countries you're transiting through. As long as you're comfortable with all of that, this actually isn't a bad time to go. Flights are pretty cheap, and tour operators are still working, even though many of them are on a skeleton staff. So I personally think we're just going to see a gradual uptick over the next year, 2, 3. But if COVID has taught us anything, you don't know what to expect. We don't know when, the next big wave or the next variant is coming out, and yeah, you've just got to be adaptable.
Absolutely. So are all the countries that you are working with, are they all open for tourism right now in Africa? Or are there any that aren't?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know for certain. I know that last year, a lot of them were closed. So in Uganda, for example, the airport was closed, completely shut down, except for repatriation flights between, I think, April and October. Then it opened up. I think at this point, everybody has opened up with rules in place. I don't know that any of these countries are not allowing visitors at this point. So I think they're all open. But again, if you decide to go, make sure you look at the rules closely so you know what you're in for. And also just know that the rules are always changing.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, that's why if you travel with NatHab, they can take care of those details for you. So one final question, beyond traveling, how can I and the rest of our audience support your efforts? Where can we donate, or how can we even volunteer to help you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me go back one slide just so that you have the website here. If you go to the website, you'll see our contact and ways to get in touch with us. You know, this is a big learning curve for all of us, including myself running this project and all the different staff that are working on it. If you have any ideas, we would love to hear from you. We at WWF are exploring ways to, because when this project was initially coined, the idea was that none of the funding would flow through the platform. We would purely serve this matchmaking function between donors and beneficiaries. We'd facilitate it however we could, but the actual financial transaction would go straight from the donor to the beneficiary. And we very much still want that to happen. But I'm also realizing, and this is also after being at the World Conservation Congress, that a lot of the donors would actually prefer to have someone like us involved as an intermediary in that. And this obviously applies to individual donors as well. So from the WWF side, particularly for the individual donors, we are exploring what mechanisms we can set up to potentially absorb any of that funding that might be out there, and also make sure that it's being directed in the best ways possible. So I would say stay tuned on that particular thing. And then as far as engaging with the project, yeah, just shoot us an email, check out the website, and we'd be more than happy to be in touch with you. And also we'll be, I don't know if it's up on the website yet, but we'll be having a newsletter that will be going out pretty regularly, and that'll be a really good way to stay up to date with all the going-ons of the project.
Great. So check out naturebasedtourism.africa for more information. That's really great to know. And if you want to travel, you go to nathab.com. Well, that's the last time we have, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Nikhil, for any closing comments you may have.
I just want to thank everyone for attending. I was looking at the attendee list, and it was a really good turnout. Thank you so much for all the fantastic questions. Thank you for NatHab for hosting this whole thing. And please do get in touch and stay in touch with us.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thanks for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd like to also thank everyone else who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including your registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available soon on our website. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.